Well, take a little look at this. A former officer from the Free French Forces who had become a history teacher at the Lycée Français de New York caused a stir at Columbia University in 1950. In his thesis entitled When New York Was Called Anglo-May, Jacques Habert, a future senator for French citizens and North American publisher of France Amérique, from 1953 through 1972, maintained that New York Bay was not discovered by Englishman Henry Hudson in 1609, as was believed, but rather 85 years earlier by the Florentine sailor sent by the King of France. In the 16th century, European royal families were competing to discover a way to India. Giovanni da Verrazzano offered his services to King Francis I. He left the port of Le Havre with 4 ships in June of 1523, sailed along the Spanish and Portuguese coast down to the island of Madeira, and set his course west. The La Daphne caravel was the only craft to reach what is now known as North Carolina in March of 1524. Verrazzano chose Franciscan as the name for this new land that no ancient or modern figure had ever seen. According to his report, and continued sailing north. The lake that became New York Bay, on April 17, 1524, the sailors caught sight of a most pleasant place below 2 small hills, with a very large river running through the middle. La Dauphine navigated its way between the two, and the crew discovered a majestically impressive river and a beautiful lake on which some 30 small boats filled with people were sailing back and forth to see us. The lake was none other than New York Bay, and the small hills were the heights of Brooklyn and Staten Island. In homage to Francis I, Count of Anglo-May, Verrazzano christened the site Nouvelle Anglo-May. However, the king, who was imprisoned in Spain at the time, never read the explorer's report. Friends, this part is the lie. We know that all the way from France, all the way down through the United States, through Louisiana, and down through Mexico, was originally called New Francia. Yes, well, most of Mexico was New Spain, but Nova Scotia was further north of New Francia. But the United States and Cuba and all of that area, Louisiana, the Louisiana Purchase, we purchased that from France. Well, wait a minute. If this country was conquered by Americans, it was our country. But no, the French conquered it, and we had to purchase it from France. So I think that proves that this area was French. Now, you go up to Canada, they speak French. And then there's a British Canada, and there's a French Canada. Because the French took it, and then the British came, and they had a war. It had nothing to do with our brave soldiers fighting the British. It was the French. And the French lost because the French were backing the southern states in the Civil War, and they lost. So by that time, they completely lost. And this is about the time they started burning down the old Francia capital of Chalago, 1893. So around 1875, they started transferring power into the British hands. This was a long war, and it started from the very beginning. But originally, this country was discovered by the French. Now, it's interesting that they were called Anglo-May, the new city of Anglo-May, because in Nostradamus' Quatrain, where he says, the new city, and fire shall leap forth at the 45th degree, and a king of terror, and all of this in his quatrains, to bring back the Mongolian king. Well, that is a completely false interpretation that they know is false, and they just keep telling everybody because they don't want you to know the truth. The truth is the word is Anglo-May, not Mongolian. And so they want to bring back the king of Anglo-May. Well, the king of Anglo-May that they wanted to bring back is a bad king, a king of terror. And we'll talk more about exactly what that means. And it isn't the original king of Anglo-May, because remember, that's in France. Well, Jesus' wife, Mary Magdalene, and Jesus and his children, and the knights that protected the Holy Grail were there in Marseille, France. And we've talked about the history going down all the way to Peter Waldo, otherwise known as Pierre Valdez or Peter Valois or Waldo or de Vaux, Valde de Vaux. And that's where my ancestors got the name Vose. And the Vaux line, when they went to Britain, became Vause. And when they went to Boston, New York area, they became Vose. Today, there are Valos that are from that same line, but they changed it depending on where they would go. Same bloodline. And they reigned there, and they reigned all the way up the Rhone, from Marseille, France, Lyons, and up to Paris. Now, some people believe Paris, and it's probably true, came from a people that were called Paris. But it could also be Paris is Peter, because, you see, Peter Waldo was probably not even his name, just like Peter. His name wasn't Peter. This was the true Pope. And he had thousands of followers, the Christians, the Cathars, all the Gnostics and all the original Christians were still existing. All the way down 1100, 1200, 1300. That's why they had the Inquisitions. The Cathars were rooted out. The Waldensians, or the people that believed and followed the Papa Valley, the Pope of the Valley, and sometimes they were called Albigensians because they were up in the mountains of the Alps. I want to tell you more about Peter Waldo. I don't know if we'll get too much of it into that today, but this was a holy place, France. It is where they were protecting the Holy Grail. And the Holy Roman Empire, from Charlemagne on, they got another bloodline from Baghdad of Jeconiah, and they used that as a royal bloodline to reign. These became a different group of Judeans. But the original Judeans that were in France and even in Spain, like this individual, Nostradamus, was of Judean descent. And I believe he was not of the bad line. Nostradamus was born, or lived, I think he was born just outside a few miles from Marseille, France. Well, I guess they pronounce it Marseille. But it comes from Jesus' wife, Mary. That's where they landed. And this is the country of liberty. And this is where we get the Liberty Phrygian cap that is on the Statue of the Republic. When they came over here and made their new France, and they made Chicago their capital, and they put up the Republic, the Statue of the Republic, it was a republic based on the principles of Jesus Christ. If you look at what he's talking about here in his prophecies, if you listen to people interpret it, first of all, they're interpreting it wrong and mistranslating words on purpose. But they don't know the meaning of it because they don't know how to speak French or whatever, and they're reading it and wondering what these towns mean. They don't know the history. Well, it's very important that you know the history of this Anglo-May. This is where the Visigoths, when they destroyed Rome, the Lombards took Italy, and the Goths took Rome in 405. And these Germanic Viking tribes were barbarians, and they were ruthless. They were terrorists, literally. They did what you heard stories of Genghis Khan. They went all the way to Japan and wiped out every man, woman, and child along the way, and came back and up through Russia and took Moscow and down, and Sweden and Britain from the Druids. And they were these barbarians that were always fighting with the Roman Empire. And Julius Caesar even talked about how barbarous they were and evil. We'll call them the Vikings. Well, these Vikings that then became kind of almost like the British later on, I mean, it took a long time for them to root them all out, that took over France. They didn't fully take over France. Remember the big massacre of the Templars in 1300 and something on Friday the 13th? They were still battling. And somewhere around, I mean, you know, each Inquisition pushed them out further. They went up to Breton, and they called it a place called America. And so this is why when they came to America, they called it America, because that's where they sailed from, also from Plymouth Rock. They sailed from there, and that's why they renamed it. Now, other people came in and called it New York, from the York Rite, from the Vikings who had taken over Britain. But the original were the French, and they were pilgrims that were trying to flee persecution. And they called it France, the New France. And they called New York Angulemi, because that was the place that they revered, one of the places. I mean, they look at Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and other of the American forefathers. They revered like places like Monticello and Montpelier. And we got the Statue of Liberty from this fraternity and liberty and stuff. So France was all about this liberty. They were the ones that had the big revolution. So there's a lot to the story of France. I mean, what the Viking Germanic peoples did to the French and then to the Spanish for hundreds of years would make your nose hairs cringe to think of the torture. We hear about these inquisitions. They burned people alive at stakes and fried them in frying pans. And so they fled to America and made a constitution. This is real. They wanted liberty. And they were not for those Viking barbarians. And so this Nostradamus, who was also one of these descendants of Mary Magdalene, was also a prophet. And he wrote all of this down. But today it's been hidden from us. We don't know. They say this means the Mongolians. Well, the king of the Mongolians is not what it's talking about. It's the king of the Vikings that came and took Angulemi. And they came from Lombardia. They were the Lombards that came. There's another quatrain that talks about this eagle thing, and they say, oh, it must be the United States. Well, the word isn't even eagle. It's this town that is in just east a little bit of northern Italy, where these Lombards came in and took northern Italy. And so the Goths and the Lombards and these Germanic tribes came down and took Europe, and they were the kings of terror. And so the king of terror is going to come back again at 45th degree. Well, New York is 45 degrees north. Now, you see, we think that the fire is going to hit New York, like it's going to be persecuted and destroyed. But it may be talking about New York being, in 1999, trying to bring back this king of terror that took Angulemi. And then, just as they did then, they renamed it to something today as Chaniti or something. Well, they renamed this Angulemi to New York after the Northern York infiltrated Masonic rites, which was the York Rite. And if you'll remember, and we've talked about this before, that entire area around New York and further north up into Massachusetts and that whole area were full of polygamists. They were called the Cochranites, and there were lots of them. It was kind of the religion in that area. They were all Masons. And so Brigham Young came from there, and he was polygamist. They were living in polygamy, all these Cochranites and all these York Rite Masons. And they heard about Joseph Smith over in Illinois, going through Ohio. And he had the true rituals and rites from Mary Magdalene, which was more preserved in the Scottish Rite. And they had to completely revamp the whole thing. So they sent Brigham Young in to murder the prophet and infiltrate the church. And they put all these York Rite symbols and temple rituals, and they built this big Gothic temple in Salt Lake City, which is not at all like the Athenian-style architecture that Joseph Smith preferred, and nothing like the community that he had proposed and the teachings that he had proposed. And Joseph Smith did not believe in polygamy and swore on a Bible that he was not a polygamist. His wife swore there was no polygamy. His children, all the people around him, and all of the people that followed Joseph Smith, thousands and thousands, 70,000 people in Nauvoo, none of them went with Brigham Young to Salt Lake City. Brigham Young took his own York-Rite Masons that just newly converts. They were all itching to carry out their kingdom of the devil and their perverted rites of polygamy and wife swapping and spiritual wifery. And they murdered Joseph Smith. Read his letters from the Carthage jail in Illinois. He denied all of it, and none of the children of any of these supposed wives were ever born that said they were children of Joseph Smith. There was no cohabitation whatsoever. We know this. And all the supposed wives of Joseph Smith were actually wives of Brigham Young, and he took them to Salt Lake. Emma Smith hated him. None of the people that followed Joseph Smith would go. And all of the prophets and apostles that were with Joseph Smith denied Brigham Young and never denied their testimony about the Book of Mormon or Joseph Smith. But they murdered him and George Washington and the rest and the founding fathers and buried all of that as quickly as they could. This is also where the spirit wrappings and all this stuff was happening. Of course, Mary Magdalene, of course, Madame Blavatsky went over there and said, this is demons and this isn't the true spirituality. She told him straight up. But we know who the original king of terror was, is Attila the Hun. And there were actually several of these kings of terrorist kings. But it's very curious that now the king of terror comes from this place called New York. And it says the fire shall leap up to New York and spread from there. Now, it's going to leap up to New York and spread from New York all around the world. That's what the actual quatrain says. Beginning what? From 1999. What happened in 1999? What does this have to do with New York? Well, we're the terrorists, remember? But isn't it interesting and ironic that we called the people that we were murdering terrorists? But we started around 1999. We went over there in Kosovo. We bombed NATO with Clinton's permission. Of course, we have footage today that shows Biden, way back in those days, who came out publicly pushing the idea to carpet bomb and destroy Kosovo, wiping out that area around Yugoslavia and Croatia and Serbia. Remember those wars going on at that time. And it was like, since then, there's been a lot of this problems we've had, and we've got the Ukraine situation now. But there's a lot of stuff going on there because from ancient times, there are these individuals that have taken power. And these are these Germanic individuals that we talk about all the time, the Bavarians, and they rule everything. But I don't believe that when the British won the war that it was all over. I think that there were people, even if they didn't know they were doing it, by divine providence, I believe that there's always been some sort of a kind of a war of words. The good guys and the bad guys both planted their flags, and they're both here. And there have been good people that have come up, like Washington and President Lincoln, who have tried to get rid of the money lenders and the bankers and have tried to do, I think Lincoln got caught in a civil war. And I don't know that necessarily the French were the bad guys. Maybe the British were really the bad guys. And maybe the Franks were or weren't. Maybe the Franks were also ruled by the same guys. I mean, the Hegelian dialectic goes on and has been going on for a long time. But what we know is that the good guys were originally in France and they were rooted out. And they're the ones who came over here first. And their capital, I believe, was Chicago. And I think there's absolute evidence for that. And I think they've eradicated all knowledge of that so that we don't know. We don't even, they even lie about it when they say, oh yeah, you see those maps with elk. That's not really Franca. They didn't really call it France. This wasn't New France. That was just one map somewhere some crazy guy wrote. Yeah, that Chicago, that probably didn't really exist. Who knows? Maybe it's just some superstition. No, we got maps, many of them, showing all of this. This was the New France. And Spain was over in Mexico too, and a lot of the countries were trying to come over here. Well, the British and the Germanic peoples ruling over the British were also trying to take over. And they ended up winning financially and in many other ways. But remember, we're still getting information. There's still a rustle underneath. These bad guys all know the stuff that they study in school and higher learning teaches them the truth. But it's like they just don't see it. I don't know if they know what they're doing or what. I think a lot of people probably to this day are still good-hearted people, don't really understand the spiritual war that's going on here. So I do believe that Nostradamus was telling us something very profound. And when you read, if you knew the language that Nostradamus was using when he wrote it, and if you could read it, and you knew all the history and you understood what was going on, this would not be some big enigma as much as it would be if you knew and understood all of this. Same with the Bible. We don't know the culture. We've been, actually, not only do we not know the cultures and what was going on, we've been purposefully lied to about it. They've eradicated some concepts about the past that we don't. It's not that they've removed history. It's that they've interpreted it in such a way we don't see it. And they don't talk about hundreds of years here or there. They just accentuate this or that, and they get us believing in a certain thing. Like that there's only this one group came over to America. And there hasn't just been one group. There's always been these two. There's been the group that's trying to establish peace and goodness and love and the kingdom of Christ. And there were those who were trying to defeat it. Because in the spiritual realm, there's only those two forces. Jesus and his angels, and the devil and his angels. And they have been separating and making the two armies on both sides. And I don't believe the Lord's ever given up his side of the battle, but the battle is spiritual. We don't use guns and weapons. There are people, even if they don't know it, that are being inspired to write things or to invent things or to do things that somehow, by divine providence, keep the world learning what the Lord wants us to learn. And then we can make our own decisions about this. And now we're in the time of decision. But the great king of terror, to bring him back, we're talking about the Vikings, here's America. We're all beautiful, a new Anglo-May, right? This is the kingdom of Marseille and the liberty cap of our Mother Mary Magdalene. That cap was on the staff of the Republic in Chicago, the original capital of this country. And as we said the other day, they replaced the Phrygian cap, our Mother Mary's liberty cap, Lady Liberty, and they replaced it with a plaque that says Liberty, surrounded by the laurel wreath, which they surround anything that they don't like with that laurel wreath to mean they have authority. They have conquered you. They have victory. It means victory. This is why they're always holding up the peace sign. It doesn't mean peace. It means victory. Yeah. You see, that guy, real good friends of Trump, that was also good friends with Nixon, and Nixon was friends with Trump, whatever. Nixon was always raising the peace sign, right? On both hands. It meant victory. The elites are pulling us off behind the scenes. We don't know what they're talking about. We don't know why there's a little town up not too far from Washington called Alexandria. Why they named it that, or why they named it Plymouth Rock or America or anything. They don't tell us, act like, oh, we don't know. Amerigo Vespucci, who knows? Well, I guarantee I know. The good guys came from America, over in France, in Breton, not Britain, and they sailed from there in Plymouth Rock. And they made a new France. And they were here for like 300 years before 1800, 1776. They were probably here from 1500. They had a thriving. Remember, Paris, France was the first city to have lights. They called it the City of Lights because they had lights on the street corners. They were the most technically advanced city in all the world. And they came and they settled America. The Canadians, or the Arcadians, that goes back to that Greek Peloponnesian and the great paradise that was brought here from Jesus Christ and Mary Magdalene and the Templars, that are bringing that tradition from the Heliopolis that we've talked about in all the other videos. And they took it to France and they made their beautiful cities. But the Goths came down and took over Rome and took over Ptolemy. And that was the King of Terror. And that's what Nostradamus is alluding to. And so why, when he mentioned 1999? Well, the Gulf War really started in 1991, but it wasn't actually the war on terror. It was just some operation we did over there in the Gulf. The 9/11 thing was what, 2001? So what is 1999? Is this war in Bosnia? And this is probably a continuation of the war in Ukraine going on right now. But they sent these jets and missiles and they just bombed everybody. And a lot of people died. And I don't think we realize just how many people may have died in that war. But from that time, 1999 on, we have been calling these individuals terrorists. And, that's when Al-Qaeda was created. Remember, we created Al-Qaeda. And he was called the terrorist, right? And it was right about then that these guys all started coming to power. Al-Qaeda and, the PLO and all of these things. This is when they had their reign of terror. And it starts with New York to bring back the King of Terror. And their fire spread throughout the world until it will end in complete overthrow of the world. I don't even know if the fire has to do with missiles or war, or if it just has to do with the fire or the wrath or the terrorism that was infected and came to New York and now is spreading all over the world. And even though Trump's got his New York Tower there, I don't know if it has anything specifically to do with the city or just a symbolic new city that this New York represents, the new city, the new kingdom, like the new capital of the King of Terror. So Nostradamus was not just talking about and alluding to biblical things, but he was also alluding to many things that happened in France that you and I have never been told about, is a prelude to all that's happening now. Most people don't know there's a war between these people who want to be under law and order and those who want to be under freedom. Well, they still have the war going on, Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and liberals. But they have infiltrated both parties and they've gone to both extremes. But in a sense, it's still really a spiritual battle. It's only that we finally realize that both sides has now been co-opted. The idea of the battle between the hard-nosed conservatives and the liberals, right, and the British and the French and all of this, it's kind of been put into some kind of stereotype, like the real battle, a spiritual battle that was going on. They kind of figured it out. It was happening, the bad side. And so they're playing it out, but in such an extreme way. And they're trying to influence you the best they can to pick their side, because they know now, the bad side knows, that they can come in with weapons and murder and kill, but they always still in the end lose. Truth always wins. So they're realizing it's a spiritual battle too. And this is why they, in the last, few years, have been trying to get the kids with porn and violence and insanity. They gotta have education and propaganda. They got it. They figured it out. So they changed the battle between liberty and death to Republicans and liberals or something. But I am absolutely convinced that Nostradamus was telling a story in a very, very symbolic way, that the only way you would be able to interpret it is to understand this language and the culture, and then you would be able to understand Nostradamus, what he's trying to tell you. He gives you a specific date, even with the month, the 7th month, which, remember, in our system is July. But when you really understand from where he's coming from, you begin to understand what he's really doing. When he says Hister, it sounds like Hitler, and he was talking about Hitler, but he's born on the river Hister. So now you've got Angolame that he says will bring back the King of Terror, and a fire will leap up to this place of the new city to bring back the King of Terror and the old king of Angolame, which is Attila the Hun, who was brutal and a lot like Genghis Khan, because they were all under the same kind of banner. They were the same Germanic tribes that was going around murdering everybody. So this is what we have been now for the last 30 years in this country. We've been the King of Terror. And so who really is the King of Terror? Was it Clinton? No, I don't believe that. He's gone. He's an old guy. He's just sitting there drooling in his suspenders now and watching some show on Netflix right now, probably in an old folks home. Obama? No, I don't for a minute believe Obama's in charge of anything. They used Obama. I'll tell you one thing. One of the people that was there with Clinton at that time that they started bombing in 1999, they started bombing from March, April, May, June, right in there. They were bombing up to about the 7th month. They stopped bombing right about that time around June. And that was a NATO allied bombing that started this entire war now that's moving into Ukraine. And we've had all kinds of wars and problems since then. Crimea and all of this stuff. Well, the allusions to all of this from the ancient times, 400 years ago, 500 years ago, and the names and things that were there in France, we don't understand. But many of these places have counterparts here. They were going to name New York Angolame. And now here we are, a new Angolame, being taken over by the King of Terror again, by these British Vikings. But they couldn't win. There's still a battle going on. It's still taking place here. Yeah, they ran them out of France, but now here we are, a place of liberty and justice for all. Well, they're still trying to infiltrate and take your mind. They've got very little time left. But if the King of Terror is going to be someone in America, I don't think it would be Clinton or Obama. I really don't. But I'll tell you, the president today in this country is Biden. And Biden was there and gave his approval to bomb Kosovo, that Yugoslavia area over there, back in 1999. And they went and they bombed it. They started this bombing, this terror campaign. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, carried out an aerial bombing campaign against the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia during the Kosovo War. The airstrikes lasted from 24th of March, 1999 to the 10th, I've read elsewhere it was the 11th, but in June of 1999. The bombings continued until an agreement was reached that led to the withdrawal of Yugoslavia's armed forces from Kosovo and the establishment of the United Nations Interim Administration Mission in Kosovo. a UN peacekeeping mission in Kosovo. The official NATO operation code name was Operation Allied Forces. So this is kind of when NATO and UN and they started having this power, you know. Yeah, there was war before that, back in the 90s. Bush Sr. was doing some stuff in the Gulf War, but it was more like they hadn't started on this war of terror yet, right? Now, Bush comes along in 2001. This is 2 years after 1999. They start the war on terror. But you'll see that an argument can certainly be made that the war on terror began in 1999 with these NATO airstrikes. Well, what would this have to do with the war on terror over there in the Middle East, right? This isn't the Middle East, is it? Well, it is. It's kind of a little further north up into there, but Yugoslavia in this area was originally, there were lots of Muslims and Islamic peoples there. And they weren't really getting along. And this is why we've had a lot of wars, and even the First World War. But it says the KLA was formed in the early 1990s to fight against the discrimination of ethnic Albanians and the repression of political dissent by the Serbian authorities, which started after the suppression of Kosovo's autonomy by Serbian leader Slobodan Milosevic in 1989. The KLA initiated its first campaign in 95 after Kosovo case was left out of the Dayton Agreement. Become clear the president's Rugova's strategy of peaceful resistance had failed to bring Kosovo into an international agenda. And so in 2001, Supreme Court based in Kosovo and administration by the United States found that there had been a systematic campaign of terror, including murderers, rapes, arsons, and severe maltreatments. Well, do you suppose that they didn't know what was going on, or they just did it all on their own? This terror, this is where the terror began. Yugoslav and Serb forces caused a displacement of between 1.2 million and 1.45 million Kosovo Albanians after the war. Around 200,000 Serbs, Romania, and other non-Albanians fled Kosovo, and many remaining civilians were victims of abuse. Remember that Wesley Clark, U.S. Army General Wesley Clark? He got on television. He said this in several programs and said that they told him from that point forward, that was a plan beginning from that point, from 1999. It was a plan where they were going to wipe out 5 countries. And Wesley Clark said they did just what they said they would do. Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan. There's still another country that they're going to wipe out. 2 more, Syria and Iran. And this is their plan. And it all started in 1999. And Wesley Clark, who was a U.S. Army general, tells you everything you need to know about it. Just watch that one of his programs where he gives you all this information. So this bombing campaign ended in the 7th month, July of 1999. Well, supposedly they're always trying to get rid of terror. They call them the terrorists. But we're the ones who started Al-Qaeda and ISIS. We created them, and we created these other Milosevic. He was sent in by the CIA and the people that, Russian KGB and so forth, and they planned all of this. So we're over fretting, biting our nails. Oh, they're murdering all these people. Well, we'll just let it go on for a while, and then finally they go in and mop it up. It's called the War on Terror. So the campaign of bombing lasted from the 24th of March to June 11th, 7th month in 1999. Tomahawk cruise missiles were also extensively used, fired from aircraft, ships, and submarines. All of NATO was participating. This was the great coalition with 1,000 points of light. Well, yeah, Bush's father started all this with the Gulf War in 1990-91. But that was more like it's just an operation. They went in. But he left it up to his son, who really went in and started the war on terror after 9/11. But it all really started with this great war of terror. I want to show you what the Wikipedia says about Peter Waldo. Peter Waldo, 1140 to 1205. Also, Waldo, Valdez, Waldis, French, Pierre Vadis de Vaux, Latin, Petrus Waldus Valdus. Now, the de Vaux is how it was in the Latin, and from there the Vaux went to Britain as Vos and to Boston as Vose. So I have a line back through my father that goes back to this line. Who is Peter Waldo? I had gotten a book. I'd seen a book when I was younger. My family had gotten this book on the Vose line, and it goes back to Boston and then to Britain and down back to this Latinized version of the name Vaux. Well, it turns out that this Peter Waldo is the Pierre Valdez or de Vaux, is the name of the famous hero of the story of the Arthurian legends, Percival. And so there, instead of Peter or Pierre, it's Percy. And instead of Waldo or Valdo, it's Percival. But all of these are different ways of saying the same name. But he's the star of this Arthurian romance novel, which is actually, I believe, oral traditions of this sacred truths of the lineage of the Fisher Kings. Well, the tradition that his first name was Peter can only be traced back to the 14th century. So I don't believe his name was Peter. I think that meant Pope. I think he was the true Pope from Mary Magdalene. And I believe that the Roman, we hear this in some of the legends where Martha and Mary were there in France. And Martha was able to go and kill this beast with her prayers. Well, the beast was the Roman church. The real church was down there in France along Marseille and Lyons, and all the people were Cathars, were Gnostics. So there were these two churches. Now, when we look back on the history of the church today, all we see is Catholics and a bunch of heathen that they had to, destroy and murder and put on crosses. Well, all these heathen that they put on crosses were most of the population, most of Europe, certainly France and Spain, and the Druids up in Britain, and all of these were real Christians. And to learn more about that, we've done many videos on this. So this Peter Waldo, or Pierre Valdez, he's got different, depending on what language you read about him. He was Peter, I believe, the real Pope. It's interesting. Peter Waldo is regarded by many historians, including Schulman, as having founded the Waldensians sometimes between 1170 and 1177. Remember the Waldensian Inquisition, where the Catholics went in and murdered them all. It were claimed that the Waldensians predated Peter Waldo. In his A History of the Vadios Church, Antonio Monastier quotes Bernard Abbot, all these names, writing at the end of the 12th century, the Waldensians arose during the papacy of Lucius. Monastier takes him to mean Lucius II, Pope from 1144 to 1145, and concludes that the Waldensians were active before 1145. Well, of course they were, but they became kind of known. These were the Cathars. These were the true church. They became more known by Waldo because of what they were doing to Peter Waldo. Peter Waldo ended up translating the first Bible into the common language there of the Languedoc in the France. And so really at that time, there were only two versions of the Bible. I mean, there was the Greek, the Holy Textus Receptus, which these knights protected with their very lives, and this mysterious Holy Grail. But the other translation was the Latin translation, the Latin Vulgate. So there were these two, and I think they represent the two traditions. One is the Textus Receptus that they preserved there and was translated into the language of the Languedoc by Peter Waldo. But the Latin, they were taken over by the Goths, and so they immediately translated the Bible and added some things that shouldn't be in there. For instance, God. That's their Godin, the Lombardic Godin that they worship. And it's very well proven that our word God refers to a false deity who is Adonai or Yahweh or Odin. It's the same word. And so Bernard says that the same Pope Lucius condemned them as heretics. They were condemned by Pope Lucius. They were also condemned by Pope Lucius III in 1184. Monastery also says that Eberard de Bethune, writing in 1210, claimed that the name Vadios meant valley dwellers. And I've heard that too, the Waldo or the valley. And then the Albigenses was the Alps and the mountains. So they were the people of the mountains and in the valley. So Peter Waldo, was that really his last name? Well, he was Peter of the Valley, perhaps. But then there are indications that there was a family name that somehow went back. I believe it was this family name goes back to Christ and this royal bloodline. A claim persisted until the 19th century that Waldo had not begun any new movement, but that he had risen from a pure Christianity established by the apostles in the Alps soon after Jesus' ascension. Well, I believe that. Most details of Waldo's life are unknown. Extant sources relate that he was a wealthy clothier and merchant from Lyon, and a man of some learning. After establishing himself as a successful merchant, Waldo commissioned monks to create a translated copy of the Bible. The clerics from Lyon translated the New Testament into the vernacular Romance Franco-Provençal. This has caused Waldo to be credited with providing to Europe the first translation of the Bible in modern tongue outside of Latin. Through reading his Bible and writings of the Church Fathers, Waldo became fascinated with the concepts of purity and perfection. In 1173, in pursuit of purity, he embraced poverty, and hearing an itinerant singer perform a song about Saint Alexius. Alexius had given up a large inheritance and a beautiful bride in order to live in a poverty like Jesus. Waldo sold all he had, forswore his marriage and home, and put his 2 young daughters into a convent. Waldo began traveling around Lombardy, begging and preaching about the value of poverty. Lombardy, is the Lombards that took over the Rome. They called it Lombardy at that time. And these are the ones that worship Godin and became a god in our Bibles. The region of Lombardy was a hotbed of religious reform movements at the time, many of which would later be deemed heresies by the Catholic Church. These include the Cathars, the Humiliati, the Albigensians, and the Spirionists. As Waldo gathered followers and they determined their own doctrines, they shared many features with these other reform movements. Well, they're making it sound like they're just little groups, 4 or 5 people over in a house. They started some cult. The entire area were Cathars. They had other leaders and fathers before this. I don't believe that he was the first of the popes, but this particular one was in the time when there was a great persecution going on, and he's written down in these books. But it says other events besides hearing of St. Alexius may have also contributed to Waldo's decision to take up poverty in preaching, including a rejection of transubstantiation when it was considered a capital crime to do it, and a sudden and unexpected death of a friend during an evening meal. From this point onward, he began living in a radical Christian life, giving his property over to his wife, while the remainder of his belongings is distributed as alms to the poor. Well, that's not exactly what happened. He gave all of his money to the Waldensians, to the people, because they were trying to kill him as the true heir of Mary Magdalene and wipe out this entire belief system about Mary and Jesus and all of the ancient history and truth. And they were preserving it. And that's why he wrote the Bible, translated it, because they were trying to preserve these truths. So they were going to take his money and all his wealth, meaning the whole kingdom. They were the usurpers. The Goths came down, they took Rome in 405, and they were still trying to root out everybody there and eradicate the Waldensians from France, and eventually they would take Spain, and there would be the Spanish Inquisition. And from there, they would go up to the Ottoman Empire and start the persecution up in the Ottoman Turks and up in this area that we're talking about, the Serbia and Yugoslavia. And so a lot of these individuals that they persecuted, they fled and went to America, but some of them went to the Ottoman Empire and up into this area called Serbia. And so this is why Stalin went into this area around Ukraine and wiped out millions of people. And these Germanic Bavarians took over the Ukraine. It tells you that here, that there were these Nazis that were still there in the Ukraine and here in Serbia, and they were ethnically cleansing the area of these particular Muslims. So this was the beginning of the War of Terror, but they turned it around and say it was the other way. So Waldo began to preach and teach publicly based on his ideas of simplicity and poverty, that no man can serve two masters. Well, as I said, he was always a man of faith, and his wealth didn't come from being a man who owned a clothing store. I mean, that's not how it was back in those days. He didn't get wealthy from a clothing store. This man owned 179 cities, towns, and villages along the Rhone, all the way to Paris, because he was the reigning lineal descendant of Jesus Christ and Mary Magdalene. So understand what this wealth really was that the Catholics wanted. They didn't care about religion. These were the Vikings. They were taking and oppressing people to take their land and their money, like Genghis Khan. Well, they were descendants of Mary Magdalene, who was, Mary, who was one of the Cleopatras or the high priestesses from Egypt. And all that wealth continued on with her because she was married to Jesus, who was the son of Caesar. Some of you are like, what? Okay, you have to watch some of the other videos we've done. But most of you know what I'm talking about here. They had all the combined wealth of Egypt, Persia, Babylon, Israel, Syria, and probably a lot of that wealth from Rome that they was able to take with them, because many of the nation followed Lazarus, who was the first knight to protect Mary Magdalene and Martha. And so this Lazarus was originally Caesar. He had been raised from the dead. Horus had raised up Osiris, Lazarus. And so he was a saint. People would make pilgrimages to see Mary and Lazarus. Well, then there was this tradition, and they were preserving the truths. They were preserving the scriptures, the holy faith, and trying to make libraries and constitutions and the Magna Carta, and along the way they kept throwing them out and burning down their roads and libraries and villages and taking their money. Now, they never told them where all the money went. You've heard of the money that the Templars had? This is where it comes from. And so they never found it. All they did was start banking the bad guys, and they ended up with their own money. And they did get a little bit of money from the czars when they went to Russia, and I'm sure they had some that they'd captured, but they didn't get much, because the true Templars took that with them on the boat, and they buried it somewhere here, and they built a New Jerusalem. And now we know that they were building it there at Chilago in that area. Some had thought it might be up further north towards Nova Scotia, that there was a place that they called the New Jerusalem. Well, somewhere in this country, they were going to build it, and that's what Joseph Smith was talking about. That whole movement, thousands of people coming all around the world to see the great prophet in Illinois, is not just some fluke, some young man that stood up on a hickory stump. They were already believers, and they knew that the persecuted pilgrims had gone, and that the great prophet was going to actually build the New Jerusalem. But again, it was thwarted, and apostasy set in, and the devil, in the form of the great dragon, went after the woman, and water went out of his mouth after the woman, but the earth came to the woman's help, and she went into the wilderness, to the extremity of a new land, back to Zion, to set up an ensign of Mother Liberty. And now we're in the time of the end, and the great decision is here. By 1170, Waldo had gathered a large number of followers. Well, he didn't just gather followers, but they were already, believers. But many of them began to try and think, well, maybe we should fight back. Eventually, they were driven out. But Waldo didn't let them fight back. He didn't believe in having material things, but he gave all the wealth to the people, thinking that they couldn't murder everybody, right? He knew they were going to murder him, and they eventually did. But then they came in and wiped out every man, woman, and child and drove them all out of that country. And they were still massacring. But of course, there were still people that were fighting. And this religious war has been going on all the way until we got to America. The war, or the inquisitions of the Goths, who were trying to destroy the descendants of Mary Magdalene in France, and Lady Liberty, and the Phrygian cap that was put on that Republic statue where they made their capital in Chicago. That's what they're trying to hide from us. So in January 1179, Waldo and one of his disciples went to Rome, where they were welcomed by the Pope. You think some heretic was welcomed by this? No, this is a meeting between the two sides of the church. Now, we don't know much about all this that was going on. We got this little story here, but they make it sound like it's just, the Pope's all this big thing, and he owns everything, and little Peter Waldo, who had nothing. Well, it wasn't really like that. What it was is Peter Waldo had the love of all the people, and they were all Gnostics, and they were all Christians, most of them. But they didn't want to fight. They wanted to love. They wanted to not be materialistic. So what they did was they hid that wealth, and that's why the Pope had to wipe them out to get rid of their teachings and to take all their wealth and their land. So he talked about a universal priesthood. Pope affirmed the Waldensians' vow of poverty, but forbade them to continue preaching due to their status as lay people. They weren't allowed to preach the gospel because they weren't, authorized by the Pope. The other Pope, right, in Italy, that was taken over by the Goths. So Waldo and his followers revolted against the ban and increased their preaching and missionary efforts. So in other words, the other church, the true church, didn't listen to the false church tell them they couldn't preach, and they went ahead and continued doing it. And they didn't gather followers, but they gathered approval and the love of the people. And they began to preach against purgatory, the prayers for the dead, indulgences. They were excommunicated by the Catholic Church, and by the late 1180s, they were being pursued as heretics. And you know the story. They went in and purged the entire area. And this continued on down, and then they killed all the Templars in the Great Massacre on Friday the 13th. They drove them all, like I say, some of them up to the Ottoman Empire, some of them went up to Ukraine, some of them went to Spain until the Spanish Inquisition, and they were driven up to Britain, and then to Plymouth Rock and Scotland, and there was the New Scotia and the New Francia, and they were the pilgrims that came to America. And this war continues to this day, my friends. Anyway, guys, I just thought that I would share a little of that history with you today. We may go into some more of that in coming videos. There is a lot I want to show and reveal about our history, but I got a lot of areas I want to cover. So please stay tuned. We'll see you guys tomorrow. Hope you have a wonderful evening. May the Lord bless you guys, and have a good one.